you. So hello, welcome from New York.
Thank you.
I remember in several of your books, at least one fiction and a bunch of nonfiction, you told the story when you were a student at Antioch a while back. You saw a cartoon taped to a wall, and it was a kid with a report card, I think, and he was coming in to see his principal, and he was disgruntled, and the principal was saying, "It's not enough to be a genius, Arnold. You have to be a genius at something."
Yeah. That was posted on the bulletin board of the English department at Antioch. Yes.
I think it's safe to say that you have demonstrated that you are a genius at something. You have written many of the most beloved books in the field. You are one of the most prolific authors in the field. You're my favorite author in the field. And I say that knowing that I'm no doubt breaking the hearts of some other people in this room. And I can't begin to overstate your contribution. Just to list a couple of things and then get past the introduction portion.
Good.
So 16 books about Scudder, almost a dozen about Bernie, the Keller books, the Tanner books, the Chip Harrison books, something like 60 books under your own name. So it's like 60 children that we know of. And dozens of others under pseudonyms that we insist on dragging out into the light every so often.
Yes, they seem to keep emerging.
So actually, well, let's
to you.
And you. So let's start with that. At one point, I talked to somebody who was a knowledgeable collector, and I said, I know Larry at one point was writing a book a month, and he said, "You're mad." He was writing a book a week. What's the truth?
No, a book a month is a lot closer to it. I was writing a book a month at one point, and this only went on for a couple of years. I was writing a book a month for one publisher and other work as well. So it probably worked out to about, 18 books a year roughly, yeah.
Oh, only.
But there is one fellow who was writing a book a month for years, and that was Bob Silverberg, who managed this astonishingly, working 9 to 5, 5 days a week. He didn't put in longer hours, and he never worked weekends. And he did 60,000 words a week. He did 2 books a month for one publisher, 1 book a month for another, and about the equivalent of that or a little more in short stories and science fiction short stories on the last week of the month. So he was writing 250,000 words a year or something like that. No, pardon me, 250,000 words a month.
Yeah. A year a month.
Yeah.
And this was largely for a category of publishing that we could incorrectly describe as pornographic, right? I mean, incorrectly because by today's standards, they were very
Well, it was
soft.
as pornographic as it was able to be, given the censorship standards at the time, so that it's quite pallid right now in that respect. Yeah.
Yeah, this isn't real hardcore smut, but yeah. It's good smut. So you snuck in crime stories, and I've always wondered when you had I don't know if you had a contract or just a handshake to do a book a month. Many of the books had no crime element.
You didn't shake hands in that business.
This was before hand sanitizer. Did they object to your sneaking crime novels in? Did they read these books?
Not many that were published by the soft-coin publishers were crime stories, but some were to one degree or another. And the way that happened on at least a couple of occasions was that I started a book that I hoped would be, on a higher level. I had started off attempting to write a mystery of one sort or another, and a few chapters in would decide that I didn't really like it that much and would finish it up for the other house.
So what was it that pushed the first one? The first book that you published under your own name, I believe, was called Mona originally.
That's right.
And then republished as Sweet Slow Death by Jove later.
Right.
And then republished as Grifter's Game by Hard Case Crime, our very first book.
Yes.
First of all, what's the story behind 3 titles? How did that happen?
Well, I think my original title for it, the one it went in on, and that sounded like a very John D. MacDonald title at the time, was The Girl on the Beach. And then there was thoughts of calling it Grifter's Game. And then the way it became Mona was there was top man at Fawcett was a fellow named Ralph Day, whom I never met, but whom Knox Berger has never said a good thing about. And Day, I don't know that he read the book, but he had this cover art that he'd bought that he wanted to use somewhere with a woman's face on it. And he said, well, let's call it Mona, and this can be Mona, and that's how that particular creative concept refined itself. Then it was published as Sweet Slow Death. That was quite bizarre because that was a blurb line for the book on an edition of Mona. So when Berkeley did it, they decided, well, we won't call it this, but here are these three words just aching to be used. So they called it that, which didn't make much sense either.
Well, one of the things I love about it is that it has a comma in it. And my opinion is that, pulp titles were at their best when they had punctuation in them. Exclamation points like "Kiss My Fist!" exclamation point by James Hadley Chase.
Yes.
And I'm Canon M dash for hire by Ed McMahon. I think the same year you did Mona, you also did a book.
Grifter's Game has the apostrophe.
There you go, exactly.
Yeah.
We still haven't done an ampersand. We've got to do one.
Yeah.
You did a book that very quickly, we were at the Edgars maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and Larry came up to me and said, there's a book I want you to see. And I said, what's the book about? And he said, I can't tell you that. If I told you what it was about, it would give the whole thing away. And I said, okay, what's the book's title? And Larry said, I can't tell you that, because if I told you that, it would give the whole thing away. I said, okay, so how am I going to find out about this? And he said, I'll send it to you. And then I opened it in the mail, and I pulled out this book. It was called Fidel Castro Assassinated.
Yep.
That was the same year as, I believe, the same year as Grifter's Game. And we're bringing it out in the first book of our 2009 list under the title, the slightly more mellifluous title, Killing Castro. It was written under a pseudonym you never used before or since.
Right.
And it's the rarest of all your books. You told me you hadn't been able to find a copy yourself.
No, I couldn't. I did an A-Libris search and finally turned up a couple of copies.
How did you come to write under the name Lee Duncan the story of 5 misfits sneaking into Cuba and killing Castro?
It wasn't my idea. It was an idea. There was a fellow who was an editor at Monarch Books named Charles Heckelman, who was a strange fellow. And he would have concepts. And Monarch was a third or fourth rate house, and they were generally third or fourth rate concepts. And this was one of them. He decided, this was in 1961, early 1961, that he dreamed this up. And he had the idea of 5 mercenaries of one sort or another going to Cuba and killing Castro. And what really made it work for him was that, well, I won't say.
Oh, yes. We don't want to give away the end.
We don't want to give the end away. But anyway, I'm sure you'll agree that that really makes it.
It would give the whole thing away. And then you wrote it, but you didn't put even one of your normal house names on it. You put a completely different name.
Yeah. I didn't even think up the name. My agent at the time, Henry Morrison, thought up the name. And there was never any reason to use it before or since. I don't think the book sold many copies. The only way I know it sold any copies at all is that there were used copies that I was able to acquire from Abe Books or whatever the hell it was. And there were only 3 of those. It really vanished without a trace. And I suspect justly so. I mean, the whole concept of it was dim and all. But, then when I looked at it, I thought, well, who am I to censor this? And that's been my take throughout as far as reprinting books with you, with hard case, and that's that. I don't feel like that much like standing in judgment of my earlier work. I find it very difficult to reread work of mine that's that old, possibly because I'm not that keen on the the self that is evident behind the words, you know. But that doesn't mean it shouldn't be available to anyone who does want to read it. And I know in this connection, I must have told you about this. I had a call or an email, I forget which it was, from Evan Hunter, a few years back. And he said that he'd been approached by you as far as reprinting the Matt Cordell books were concerned. And he said two things. He said, is this guy all right?
And you waited, you paused.
I lied and vouched for you. And then he said, and also he said, I don't know whether I really want this material back in print. He said, I don't think of it as you know, my best work or anything like it, and I don't know about that. And I said, I can't tell you what to do in that regard, certainly. But I've reprinted some earlier work, which I don't think is my best work. And I said, as far as your Matt Cordell stories are concerned, I can understand why you might have trouble reading them now, but I remember them very, very fondly, and I think they were good, you know. And finally, I said, generally, and when the question comes down to this, what I try and do when faced with two ways to go on something like this, I try to pick the one that brings money into the house.
Even if it's not very much.
And no, even if it's not very much, that's right. And he said thanks, that's very helpful, and it brought a few dollars into his house, I guess.
It did very well, and that was a book called The Gutter and the Grave, yeah. And he said he had two changes he insisted on making. I mean, he wanted to, well, the original book was I'm Canon for Hire, and he said, I want to change it, and we came up with the title, The Gutter and the Grave, but I asked him, what don't you like about the title I'm Canon for Hire? And he said, the book's not about a man named Cannon, and he's not for hire. Right. I don't see what the problem is, but and you're right about killing Castro. It's a funny thing when you read series of books that were written under a house name by multiple authors. The concepts might have been uniformly dim, for example, but you can tell when one of them was written by a really good writer, and when one was written by someone who was not. And I could imagine in another pair of hands, Killing Castro could have been a very weak book. But when I sat down and read it, I said, this is Lawrence Block. And it means something.
Thank you.
So you can get that in January. The first dozen books you wrote under your own name were standalones. I think. I mean, I don't know if it's a dozen, but it's certainly 6, 7.
I don't know if it was that many before.
Before you did Tanner.
Before Tanner. I don't think there were that many.
Maybe not. Maybe it was half a dozen. Yeah. But the first books you did were standalones.
Right.
And then you did Tanner. And after Tanner, you became best known for and spent most of your time writing series.
Yes, that's true.
How did you make that transition? Did you ever miss standalones?
It was never a transition, really. The second book under my own name was, well, originally Death Pulls a Double Cross, retitled Coward's Kiss. And that had a detective, and I tried to write more books about him. As far as I was concerned, I was perfectly happy for that to be a series. And I did write several novelettes, which have since are in the book coming out from HarperCollins, I think next month, called One Night Stands and Lost Weekends. It includes those three. But it just didn't happen to go anywhere. The first character I had that was worth doing series about was Tanner, certainly. And in fact, that was the first Tanner book was the first book where I felt that no one else could have done precisely this book. You know, with the others, the earlier work, whatever its merits or lack thereof, there was something essentially generic about most of them, And this seemed to me to be, fresh compared to the other work. And I found that I enjoyed writing in Tanner's voice, so I went on. But there have been, most series that I've written have been unintentional, in that I didn't know until after I'd done the first book that I was going to do more in the series. That certainly was the case with Tanner. It was after I'd written and sold the first book that it occurred to me that I'd like to write more about him. Actually, I might have had the thought when I was getting toward the end of the book, but certainly it was not a very firm thought until later. The first Bernie Rodenbauer book was just going to be a book by itself. And again, by the time I finished the book, I liked the character and liked the voice. Matthew Scudder was conceived of as a series. That was separate from the others. That truly was conceived of as a series and was sold as a 3-book series to Dell before I wrote the first book. Then there was this series that wasn't. And that was a book called The Specialist, right, which was a nice enough notion. It was 4 or 5 ex-Green Berets and their one-legged colonel team up to pull off robberies of one sort or another in the aid of truth, justice, and the American way. And if that sounds like something you saw on television, you did a few years after the book, but they never got in touch with me about it.
So it became a series, just not by you.
Right, right. Anyway, I wrote the one book, and it worked quite well, and the publisher was very pleased with it. And my agent said, when are you going to do the next book about these guys? And I said, well, I'm not absolutely certain, but my guess is probably never. And he said, why is this? He said, I thought it worked rather well. I said, I'm glad to hear that. I thought it worked reasonably well, and it was the kind of book I really enjoy reading, but it turned out to be not the kind of book I enjoy writing, and I don't want to do it again. And it's not as though it sold so many copies that they were sending teams of people trying to persuade me to write it again, but I knew I didn't want to. So that was one of the only intentional series I wrote, and it wound up being a short one. I remember my agent said, I don't understand this. He said, I thought this was going to be a series. And I said, well, try and get your mind around the idea of a 1-book series.
Tanner was dormant for 20 years, something like 20 years, 25? He was,
and dormant is an odd word to to apply to a character.
He was on ice.
Who's incapable of
That's
sleep.
Right, yeah. But you came back to him. What was it that tempted you back?
Well, that was kind of interesting. Signet, I guess, was going to be reprinting the Tanners, and they sent over galleys of the first 2 for me to look at. And I looked at them, and I remembered how much I'd enjoyed writing the books, and wondered, gee, it's a shame. I thought that I can't, do another. But they were set in their time, and Tanner was a fellow who'd been wounded in Korea, for God's sake. That's when he lost the ability to sleep. And if you do the math, this was in the late 90s. He was going to be a little old in the tooth to be engaging in these border-hopping adventures. And equally to the point, there was no way to account for what he'd been doing for the past however many years, I think 28 of them. And then I was, one night, I was at a concert, I remember, in Lincoln Center, and my mind was wandering, as it does. And I suddenly figured out what he could have been doing during those years, and it seemed to work so well with the character. And for those of you who haven't read Tanner on Ice, what happened was that he was drugged back in, I guess, 1973 or something like that by agents of the Swedish government who they had their reasons. We don't have to get into it now, but because it was by Scandinavians, they weren't going to kill him, so they simply flash froze him, and he'd spent the past 28 years in a frozen food locker in Union City, New Jersey. These things happen.
I remember when I think you sent me the manuscript of the book at the time, and I don't think it had a title yet, and I suggested The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. It didn't work.
No. But as soon as I got the idea for that, I just couldn't avoid writing the book. That was and it was fun. And one thing that was very interesting to me at the time, I went away to write it, and I went away in this instance to Ireland and holed up at a hotel in County Kerry, and I didn't take a computer along, although I'd been at that point using a computer for several years. I didn't know how well that would work over there or in a town there. If anything went wrong with the computer, what the hell would I do, and so on. So I decided to handwrite it, which worked well enough. But I went there, and I sat down, and I thought, am I going to be able to get into the voice? Because I hadn't written anything at all about that character in 28 years. And it was the damnedest thing, because I sat down and I picked up the pen, and Tanner's voice was just there, as if he'd spent the past 28 years in an unoccupied couple of brain cells up there just waiting for the chance to talk again. And it was quite uncanny. People ask how difficult it is to go from one character to another, and how to get the voice right. And first of all, how do I know if I get the voice right? I only know that it seems right to me. But it doesn't require any effort for me. That just seems to be a given, that if I know the character, I'm going to know what he sounds like.
I remember reading several of the Tanners back to back, including the new one, because I was working on an article for somewhere, and it was seamless. It really did, to me at least. It felt like you could have read the last one and the new one back to back, and
really?
It was the same. Really,
that's nice to hear, because as I said, there's no way for me to know.
It's an interesting voice, in part because the funny thing is, I think of the books as essentially comic. The predicaments are comic. Union City Freezer is comic, but there's a kind of sucker punch in pretty much all the Tanner books, where you think you're reading something that's essentially funny, and then out of the blue, you're hit with something that's really quite nasty, really quite grim. In one book, he cuts off a man's finger. In another, he tortures someone to get information. He sleeps with a 12-year-old girl. 13? Anyway.
She swore she was 13.
Yes, exactly. And there's a riot in one where somebody gets pulled limb from limb. And in the peak of this was one where he finds himself in the middle of Vietnam. This is during the Vietnam War, being strafed by American fighter planes. He's there. I think he has malaria on top of everything else. It steps from being comedy to being something more like Joseph Heller comedy, Catch-22 comedy. And I don't know how much of that was the political environment at the time when you were writing it, how much was deliberate, but it always took me by surprise. Beyond that, there's no question there.
Oh, good.
But it does make me wonder what Tanner would make of George Bush's world.
I don't know.
Maybe we'll find out. Maybe he'll resurface. 1976. So I think Tanner was frozen at this point. We didn't know that, but that's what he was doing.
No, that's where he was.
And in 1976, you had a year of great invention, because 76, I believe, was the year you came up with Bernie and Scudder.
No, the Scudder books were written in 74, I think, the first three. They were written one after the other in 74 and 5.
As I said, you had 3 years of great invention.
That's right. That's right.
But these characters have the greatest longevity in many ways. I mean, Tanner started earlier, but these characters are ones you've come back to repeatedly because you love them, but readers, I know, have told you that they love them. They're always nagging you for another one. I'm curious.
Which doesn't work, by the way. I'm fundamentally such a contrarian that you know, the more people tell me I ought to do something, the less inclined I am to. So, just a word to the wise.
Use reverse psychology. We could say, we hope you never come back to Scudder.
Yeah.
I'm curious where Scudder came from. He lived in a hotel, and I understand at one point you lived in a similar hotel or the same
No,
hotel?
I didn't, actually. I was living in a studio apartment, but in that neighborhood at the time.
West 57.
Yeah. Yeah, I was actually around the corner on 58th. And my agent at the time had suggested that it might be a good move to develop a series. As I said, this was developed as a series. And he said something about a tough cop. He said they weren't going to be doing Carter Brown anymore at Signet or something like that, so the opportunity for a tough cop action series existed, maybe. And so I thought about that, and I realized that much as I enjoyed reading Evan Hunter's Ed McBain books, the 87th Precinct novels, much as I enjoyed police procedural when it's done well, I had no interest in learning all of that crap, let alone trying to write it and all. I wasn't interested in that. It sounded like too much work, for one thing. Anything that sounds like too much work, I have made it my business to steer clear of over the years. I didn't become a writer because I wanted to do a lot of heavy lifting. And I also realized that writing from the point of view of a functioning member of a presumably functioning bureaucracy, i.e. the police department, would not really work for me, that I didn't think I could get that right. And so I decided that my hero ought to be an ex-cop and probably something of a burned-out case. And that's where Scudder came out from.
Yeah, I remember reading, there was a point at which Harrison Ford was talked about as a potential Scudder when, was it A Walk Among the Tombstones was being optioned?
Right.
And the story went, and who knows how these stories develop, I might have made it up, but that he had backed out in part because he thought the character was too dark. He was afraid of being associated with a character that was too dark.
I'm not sure why he backed out. I don't really know.
But I've often thought that he would have made an interesting Scudder. I know you've had mixed success.
Nah, not dark enough.
There you go. We need Harvey Keitel. The Scudder you got was Jeff Bridges in a movie version of 8 Million Ways to Die. That was a deeply flawed, problematic movie. But Bridges himself is an interesting actor, and I could see him doing a good Scudder. And you've talked to him since about Keller, right?
Yes. Well, I've met him a couple of times, and he points to 8 Million Ways to Die as something he wished he'd had another shot at. It was not a happy set. There was a lot wrong with the making of that film, which need not concern us now, but it was unfortunate, and because I thought Jeff's performance in 8 Million Ways to Die and Andy Garcia's, I thought they were both excellent performances, given what they had to work with and the direction they got and everything else.
Yeah, well, you've had famously mixed results with Hollywood, in part with the Burglar books, where they recast Bernie Rodenbar. First of all, they moved him across the country.
Yeah.
But that was the least of what they did to him.
Well, you know, the only problem I have with Burglar with Whoopi Goldberg is that it was a lousy movie. The fact that she's not the obvious casting call to play a white male bookseller in New York, that really doesn't bother me all that much. One thing one should be clear on is that it is not the job of a filmmaker to recreate the vision of the writer of the novel on which the film is based. That's not the point. The object of a filmmaker is and ought to be to make a film that works on its own merits, period, and that's all. So if that movie had been better, I would have been fine with it. However, I didn't like it, and neither did anyone else whom I've ever met. So it's that it was, you didn't have to have read the books to dislike the film. But I don't, James M. Cain had, and this gets quoted a lot, but he had the best response to a journalist who asked him one time in an interview, how do you feel about what Hollywood has done to your books? And Cain said, Hollywood has done nothing to my books. They're here on the shelf exactly as I wrote them. They're different media, and I don't think I've seen films that are too faithful to the books they came from, to the detriment of the film.
Now, since then, you've gotten involved on the screenwriting side, or the TV equivalent of screenwriting, which I guess is also called screenwriting. Yeah. You were involved with a series called Tilt, and more recently with Wong Kar-wai's movie, My Blueberry Nights.
Right.
How did that come about? How did that come about?
Wong Kar-wai has been a fan of my books for a while. He got in touch some years ago. At that time, he wanted to make a Scudder movie, but the rights weren't available. And we've been in touch about various things, and finally he proposed that I write this, and I did. And it was difficult because it stemmed from an idea of his, and he was fiercely loyal to the idea. But the picture got made. That's miracle enough these days.
True enough. And on Tilt, you were a part of a writer's room, right? There were several different writers.
That's right. There were a few of us working on that, and that was interesting to do.
Yeah, I enjoyed the series. It's whenever you have multiple writers, it's hard to pick out which pieces come from one writer and which pieces come from another. But I would scrutinize it, and I'd say, I bet that's one of Larry's lines. I have no idea if I was right or not.
No way to know.
But it's fun.
In fact, I wouldn't know, in all likelihood.
The casting game is one that people indulge in. It's sometimes a drinking game, sometimes a serious pursuit, trying to figure out who should be a given character. I won't take up too much of our time now, but I do remember you're making one recommendation once, years ago, I think I remember, for Bernie, which was that a young Alan Alda would have made a good Bernie.
At the time, there's been many years that have gone by, and Bernie has refused to age, and the various people I've thought might play him successfully have
insist on getting older.
Yes, I know.
Yes.
If they'd had any sense, instead of being flesh and blood people, they would have been characters in books and could have stayed the same age forever.
Whatever it's worth.
Even as you and I.
Exactly. My recommendation, should anyone from Hollywood be in the room, I have no recommendation for Bernie, or for that matter for Scudder, but every time I read a Tanner book, and I make a point of rereading them at least once a year, rereading a Tanner book, they're really terrific. And in fact, they just came out in new editions, I think, recently.
Yep.
So you can get them very easily, and they're terrific. I always think of Nicolas Cage in the last few years. He just looks like a man who hasn't had a good night's sleep in decades.
Interesting.
Scudder. I like, you didn't want to give away the end of Killing Castro. I don't want to give away the end of the most recent Scudder book. Beyond, I don't think I'm going to spoil anyone in the audience by saying he's still alive at the end. I don't think that's a terrible spoiler. There are 16 books, and he has survived every one of them. But there's a moment.
So far.
That's actually it. There's a moment toward the end. All the Flowers Are Dying is the most recent Scudder, and there's a moment toward the end where he's badly wounded. And in some sense, his whole life is flashing before his eyes, and it's the life we've shared with him. So it goes back to Estrelita Rivera, the girl whose life was taken by chance before the first book, and all the way up. And it felt, as I was reading it, as though you might have been considering killing him. I don't know whether you were, and I was sort of curious.
No, wasn't.
I always love killing people.
I was willing to let you think that might happen, but no, it was never in the cards. I think writers generally make an enormous mistake when they kill a series character. Sometimes people don't object that much. When Johansson killed, or not killed, he recorded the death of his lead character, David Brandstetter. That was a while coming, and it seemed to be the logical thing to have happen. So that people accepted. But when Nicholas Freeling rather arbitrarily killed off Inspector van der Valk, there was this great revolt on the part of readers, who most of them seemed to, at that point, have thrown that book against the wall and never read anything else of his, you know. And one doesn't want to do that sort of thing. Also, you know, you don't want to throw your guy over the Reichenbach Falls and then have to invent something later on when you've decided that you want to do some more of the books. So.
He was rescued by the Swedish military.
Yeah.
No, I was going to mention Reichenbach Falls. The other example that comes to mind is, was it T.S. Stribling who wrote the Poggioli stories? And there's a writer whose work might be in the dealer's room, but if so, it'll be very expensive because he's pretty obscure. He wrote a series of short stories about a character named Poggioli, and about halfway through the series, he killed him off. But he then continued recording his adventures after death, and at some point simply ignored the fact that he had died in an earlier story. So sometimes obliviousness is the best.
Yeah, I think if the readers really like a certain character, they won't let themselves be, you know, deterred by the fact that he died a while ago.
So
you accept these things.
Scudder also, one of the things I love in rereading Scudder books, and I do that also reasonably frequently, the Scudder from the 70s has a wonderful quality of New York in the 70s. It gives you a feeling for the city, and of course I grew up in New York in the 70s, so this is home for me, and I've often thought it would be interesting to read a new story about Scudder in that period.
Probably be tough to write. The closest to that was When the Sacred Gin Mill Closes, which was written in the mid-'80s and describing events about 10 years earlier. And it was recollection on Scudder's part. And interestingly, that book was reviewed by Richard Snow, the editor of American Heritage, who saw it as an historical novel, and said that it made him realize for the first time that the 70s were now period. Right. Yeah. But I have trouble, I think, writing in a period other than the one I'm living in at the time. I haven't really tried to, but I'm in awe of people who write historical fiction, you know, and there's some of it that I like very, very much. Most of it isn't very good, I don't think, but the stuff that is quite wonderful, and I enjoy it very much. And I can't, under any circumstances, imagine myself doing anything like that. How the hell do I know how they talked in 1860? You know, I don't, and neither does anyone else, and I don't object to the invention when I'm reading it, but I would not feel confident when I'm writing it.
Yeah, there was, you did a short Scudder story in the last few years. Maybe it was Looking for David that was set back in?
Yeah.
But that's a short,
the Scudder short stories recently have been that sort of recollection, but they're generally, you know, they're narrated in the present.
Yeah, and they're very good. I remember Looking for David being just one of the best stories I'd read that year. Looking for David, was that?
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Let's talk about Keller. So
Sure.
this is the book.
Might as well say a few words about the book we're able to sell.
So there have been 4 Keller books, and this is in some sense a different type of Keller book than the first 3.
Yeah, well, this is the first one that a novel in the traditional sense of the term. I would argue that they're all novels. That that Hitman, the first book, while each of the chapters was published, each of the chapters except the last was published in a magazine prior to that as a wholly contained short story. At the same time, from around the third one on, I knew I was writing a novel, so that there was, when it was time to put them together, there was no editing required. And I have always thought of it as an episodic novel, and the same thing is true of the two after that, most of which were not published independently. Some chapters were, but many were not. But Hit and Run is different because it's essentially a single episode that covers the whole book, though it takes some months from start to finish. And I was very pleased with the way it went. Judging from the reviews and the direct response I get through email, people are happy with it.
Yeah,
so who knows?
Well, Keller is a very satisfying character to read about, which is in some ways surprising because he's an unrepentant killer. He's a professional killer who kills people for hire, and we are very fond of him. He's someone we really want to take under our wing.
Yeah, and I don't know how to explain it. I didn't see that coming, to tell you the truth, when I started writing about him. Of course, the Kellers started as a single short story with no sense that I'd ever write a second, let alone that, 4 books. And people did like him. I liked him, but I'm easy, But people did, and I didn't know that they would. I don't know that I cared whether they would or not, or when I was writing the stories. And I know my mother, who read the books in manuscript, I would send her copies, and after the second, I think, which was the last one she read, and she said, I was really worried something would happen to Keller, she said. And I asked myself, why the hell do I care, So she seemed to like the character, and a response that I really liked was when I got at a reading I did in Marin County one time, and a woman who, it's remarkable how often you go around to do a reading, presumably to sell books to the people who come to the reading, and most of them have already read the book. What are they there for? But who knows? Anyway, this was a signing for Hit List, and this woman said, I think there's something almost subversive that you're doing in these books, and I don't even know if you're aware of it, she said. And I'm never aware of anything that I'm doing. And she said, I was reading Hit List, and I was sitting in my living room, and at one point, I put the book down on my lap, and I looked off into the middle distance, and I actually said out loud, well, so he kills people. What's so bad about that? And it was never my intention to engender this response, So it goes.
Well, it's one of the things you've done throughout your career. I remember when I was reading the first Bernie books, I was, now maybe this says more about me than about you or the character, but I was overcome with a sense that burglary would be a good career choice. It seemed pretty much harmless. Anyone who got anything stolen from them had more to lose and didn't miss what they lost. Bernie never really got caught. He got out of trouble. And I thought, I could teach myself to pick locks. And then I read some of your other books, and in each case, not so much the Scudders, but in many cases, you get deep into the head of a criminal, and you make that person's perspective entirely sympathetic or at least understandable. These are not mostly homicidal maniacs and evil people. They're criminals, but there are worse things to be.
Yeah, I don't know when you look at the whole body of work in aggregate and realize the number of genuinely antisocial people I've come up with as heroes, it makes me wonder about myself, I have to admit. But I'm not good at writing about oh, knights in shining armor.
Yeah.
Not my kind of guy.
I remember you had a book called Not Coming Home to You, which is a fictionalization of the Starkweather murder spree.
Right.
And that is as close as you came, I think, except some of the Scudder villains, to having a truly horrible main character. I mean, he's completely remorseless and will slaughter anything in his path without the slightest feeling of emotion. It's not even as though he does it because he's angry at people. He does it because they're there and he has a knife or a gun. And there's a wonderful scene, one of my favorite scenes you've written, where he and his girlfriend are on this killing spree and they stop at a house. And they have a brief domestic interlude. They're being hunted, their doom is coming closer and closer, they will be captured eventually, he'll be killed. But they have a moment where they're in a house, and I think the people who live there are out, and they have a brief respite of maybe a day and a night, and they live together in this other house as though they were ordinary people living an ordinary life, and the female character sort of aches for that domesticity they'll never have, and it's heartbreaking. It's really, really beautiful. That's one of the cases I can think of where you've got people who are leading a criminal life and they get a taste of this other thing and they can't have it, and it just breaks your heart. So I recommend that book.
Thank you, thank you. I had always had fond feelings about that book, and especially about that scene.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
and we had never talked about it before.
And because that scene, of course, had absolutely no counterpart in real life. With
one assumes not.
Yeah.
Keller is a traveler. He is a directed traveler, unlike some of the other travelers you've written about, and I dare say also occasionally in your life been. Keller goes places because he has an assignment, and when he's done, he leaves. But while he's there, he often dreams of what it would be like to stay. And so he wanders around the country and he samples the lives in various locations, and he always goes back to doing the thing he does, and which is kill people. And he does it with a little bit of remorse sometimes, or a little regret that he's not someone other than who he is, but you are who you are and you do what you do. And I've often wondered how that translates into your own experience, because I know at one point you took off a whole year, I think, or was it maybe more?
A little more than a year, close to 2.
And you had no fixed address during that time. You had a car, you drove around in the South exclusively, or where were you?
All over.
And how did you get mail?
We got it forwarded to us. Everything was forwarded to one of my daughters, and every once in a while she would, express mail something to some post office somewhere, and we would contrive to be there to pick it up. It was fun.
Would you ever do that again?
Probably not, because we did it. I don't think I would want to try doing it again.
And you've also traveled to...
Also, that was, in the late 80s, and you could really find $15 a night motels, and lots of things were more doable.
And this was, I think you did something like that in the 70s too, when you were...
Oh, yeah.
So when you go on these trips, what are you looking for, and do you find it?
Gee, I don't know. In the 2-year period in the late 80s, we created the illusion of purpose. We were looking for towns named Buffalo. And I wrote about this for American Heritage. We were looking for towns named Buffalo, and that, as I said, supplied the illusion of purpose. It gave us a reason when we came to a crossroads to turn left rather than right, or whatever. So that was the leitmotif, if you will, for the trip. But beside that, what were we really looking for? I don't know.
It's funny, in the 70s you wrote a story called Collecting Ackermans, which is about a serial killer, and we discover over time that what he's doing is killing people named Ackerman. There's no reason he's killing people named Ackerman. It's a name, and it's a pattern, and it gives him something to do. And then I think at the end of the story he picks a second name, maybe one starting with B. I can't remember, but at least you chose a less bloody form of passing the time.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Though you don't know what we were doing out there.
The other book that you've got coming out, you may have a couple, but the one that I've read in the manuscript is a memoir.
Yes.
And it's a memoir of your experiences walking and running.
Yep, yep. It's called Step by Step, A Pedestrian Memoir. And in a sense, that's really really what it is. It takes the frame of recounting a year, the most recent year, yeah, as a race walker and marathoner and ultra marathoner. But in the course of it, I've never tried memoir before, and I found myself writing far more about early days than I expected I would. There's a lot of childhood and adolescent stuff in there that I never thought I'd write about, that I actually never really wanted to think about. But yeah, it's, I don't know, it was interesting to do. I hope people will like it.
And one of the things that, one of the things you allude to toward the end of the book is ambivalence about writing projects, about what writing projects to take on next, whether to take on any writing projects next. And I think about that in the context of Keller too. You know, to some extent, he's not sure he wants to keep on killing people. But he comes back to it, partly because he can use the money, but partly because that's what he does and that's who he is. I hope that, like Keller, you keep coming back to writing because it's what you do and it's who you are. What do you think?
I don't know. Actually, it's been a lot of years and more books than years. And it sometimes feels to me as though it might be time to hang it up. I know that most writers, if they live long enough, write one or two more books than they should have. And I'd rather not do that. But it's hard to know how it'll go. You know, it seems every once in a while, not as much lately, but people will ask the question, if you could, is there any book you'd really like to write that you've always been meaning to write and you haven't? And for God's sake, if there was anything I really wanted to write, I've long since written it. The only thing for a while there, I'd always wanted to write, or for some time had wanted to write a big, multiple viewpoint New York novel with as much of the city in it as I could manage. And I've done that since, Small Town, and I don't want to do that again. It seems to me that my various series have all reached a point of stasis one way or another. I don't know. I may be ready to stop doing this. It's hard to be certain. I know the one thing that may keep me at it is the fact that if I could have afforded to retire after the last few weeks, I certainly can't anymore.
So maybe there's a silver lining in this.
Oh, whoopee.
Yeah, exactly.
A tarnished silver lining.
Yeah, if there is a silver lining, you'd better harvest it and sell it for the silver value.
Yes, that's right. We can melt it.
Now, you have developed a sort of nascent second career as an editor. You recently edited Manhattan Noir, which I was very proud to be part of, which was a collection from Akashic, which does these terrific noir anthologies, and that was original stories. Well, you have a new one out now, which is Manhattan Noir 2, all reprints.
Yes.
You pitched that, right? That wasn't something they came to you and suggested.
Actually, it was simultaneous. I suggested it to, in an email to Johnny Temple of Akashic, whose response was that he had a note on his calendar to the following day ask me about doing that. So it proved that not only do great minds work alike, but so do lesser ones. And it's Manhattan Noir 2 is a book I take enormous pride and satisfaction in, And it was far more work than writing a book or than editing a collection of individual ones. The amount of reading I did to distill and select the material for that was considerable. But I was very pleased with the way it works out. It starts off with Edith Wharton's first published story, God Help Us, which is a noir gem. Go no. And any number of other things. There's poetry in it. I was very pleased with the way the book came out.
Do you think we were talking at an event about poetry? We both have a passion for it, which may be shared by 0 people in the audience. I don't know. There's a rich and long history of noir poetry, yes. And I would love to see a Kashuk do Manhattan Noir 3, just poetry. Well, Manhattan would be too hard.
It couldn't be Manhattan. It would just have to be a book of noir poetry or dark poetry.
You recommended 2 or 3. So if anyone's in the mood for a dark poem, we both recommended Thomas Hardy. You can't go wrong with Hap, or you can't go wrong with some of his other work. But who were the others that you were recommending?
There are lots of extraordinary things. There was a poet, 18th or early 19th century, I'm not even sure, named George Crabbe, who wrote a poem called, he wrote several dark things, but he wrote a long narrative poem called Peter Grimes, which served as the basis of the Benjamin Britten opera, and which is quite a nasty piece of work. But there's tons of things for dark poetry. There's
there's Browning. I invite anyone here to read Browning. You can go on for hours and hours with Browning and find plenty of murders and worse. So poetry, there is a connection here to your fiction because one of your series characters, who has never starred in a novel and probably never will.
No, never will.
But he's a great lover of poetry and of justice in his own mind. And this is Martin Ehrengraf, the criminal attorney. He is sort of a dark horse candidate for favorite character of mine. I just love I love the Ehrengraf stories.
You're seriously demented, Charles. You know that, of course.
So if you want some wonderfully mordant comic stories that also will give you a grounding in poetry, I recommend the Martin Ehrengraf stories, which were collected by Jim Seals, but there's never been a cheap edition of that, has there?
No, but they're all in enough rope.
Oh, they're in enough rope. Okay.
They're all, they appear on block and in order in enough rope, the big collection.
So along with all the other recommendations, the bottom line from all of this is go out and buy Lawrence Block's books. You will not go wrong. The collected short stories are many nights reading, maybe not 1001, but there are many nights reading, and one's better than the next. It's just really, really good stuff. So I understand that we're coming up on the tail end, so a practical matter. In fact, I think we're 60 seconds from the end. So I first of all want to thank Larry. You have done wonderful, wonderful things for everyone in this room, including coming here to talk.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all.